Hey guys, welcome back to another week of the research methodology training. This is class three. Hope you guys all had a great 2 weeks. Sorry for the last week that I was away. I was actually defending my PhD thesis, so I think that's a pretty good excuse for having to miss this class. And I'm happy to say that it went well. I passed the defense, and I'm officially set to graduate for next year. So I'm very excited about that. Uh, just to tell you guys a little bit more about, because I think it'll be interesting for you to know, especially someone who's into research. Um, the PhD thesis is often kind of, I think, what people mostly consider the last step in kind of what research entails in the academic and professional world. So it's often the point at which you're really contributing, hopefully, something new to the world in terms of science. Like you're advancing some kind of, uh, you're advancing a point to where you are the foremost expert in whatever topic that you're talking about. So I thought, just to tell you guys a little bit more about my experience, it was first of all, it was nerve wracking. It was terrifying. Basically, the way the defense works is you walk into this room, and there's three, four people who's your counsel, and you present your thesis, your paper, um, for about an hour. You're talking about a lot of the things that we talked about last week. You're going through the methodology, you're going through the results, you're going through why you did it, what your hypotheses were, what the results were, and then you're talking about your analysis. Um, and I think I showed you guys 2 weeks ago about exactly what my thesis was. It was basically on the non-drug interventions that you can do for chronic illnesses, addressing anxiety, depression in specifically in systemic sclerosis, which is a kind of autoimmune disorder. Um, so yeah, so a lot of what I was talking about was very similar to the things that we were talking about last week. And in fact, uh, I believe almost everyone here sent their assignments from last week or from 2 weeks ago. So thank you for that. And as I was going through it, I thought you guys had a very good grasp on um, a lot of what I was talking about, which was very validating. But just to highlight some of the things, I believe Rupsa Sen, I'm not sure if they're here. Oh, yeah, they're here. You were talking a little bit more about how you were interested in mathematics and you had some trouble kind of finding divisions between an intro, a method, a result. Um, yeah, so I think, like I said last time, the more theoretical a field becomes, the harder it is to really make these kind of differentiations because the method um, is so tied into the results. Like the methodology itself is the very result that you're trying to get. Uh, so yeah, so I think for especially, and you can't get more theoretical than the field of mathematics. So that's definitely one extreme in which this kind of standard paper model becomes a little clunky. You're probably not going to be going through the exact same tiers. It's interesting. Like I remember 8 years, man, it's so long ago now. 8 years ago, uh, even longer, I guess. I was doing I was in IB math, and our last assignment was we had an internal assignment to do a paper in math. And I remember wondering about this exact same thing. I was so used to making physics lab reports and biology lab reports where you have such a clear demarcation of intro methods, results, analysis. And it was so much easier to think about. And when I was writing my math paper, it was so much harder to conceptualize what should I talk about next. Um, but we're definitely going to get back to that idea of what are some other other ways of writing a paper. And in fact, today what we're going to be doing is going through another version of the paper, and a unique form of research that you can do. So I like to kind of focus in on. I like to go general first, and then zoom in and specify. Okay, like what are different permutations of kind of a general topic that we talked about, which is how I like to structure my class. So if you guys remember in the first class, I talked very broadly about what research means, where it can do good, where it can do bad. And then I talked more specifically about the overall structure of a paper. And now I'm going to be talking very specifically about one particular kind of paper that you guys can do. And let me know in the chat if everybody can hear me okay. Okay, so yeah, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, please put in the chat or just interrupt me. You're more than free to ask at any point in time. So let's get started. Reviewing some more of the assignments. There's some general topics that I wanted to talk about. One was that I received an assignment that was excellent. It was very, very well done. It's just that some of the specifics of what they thought were a hypothesis was not so much wrong as it was too general. I would also like if everybody could also send me a link to the actual papers that they were going through, either just author name and title or specifically a link to the paper itself. That would be great, because then I could kind of read through the paper and then read through your analysis as well. But when I was going through this one, it was one of the problems I think with having a very general hypothesis is that it becomes hard to disprove. And this is one of the key points of having a hypothesis, that you want to be able to say that you're wrong. If you have a very general one, it's going to be difficult to even move forward. So I wanted to hammer that point home again. When you guys are going to be doing your own, don't be scared of making a very specific guess, because that's the entire point of it. The more specific the guess, actually, the easier it becomes to think about the consequences and move forward in your experiment or in your study or in whatever you're doing. It becomes much easier to think about what your next step is. So make sure to not be scared of getting too general, or even having, another option that another student sent me is there was a study in which there were many hypotheses. I believe there were like 5 or 6 in the paper that they were studying. And that too is totally fine. It's just that you have to be careful that you're not using that as an excuse to kind of always be right, if that makes sense. What I'm saying here is that whether you succeed or not is not based on whether you got your hypothesis right. And I just wanted to hammer that point home, because I did get the feeling that as some of you guys, the hypothesis that you claimed from the paper might have been a little too general, or and of course I'm not sure. I didn't also receive the paper titles from some of you guys, so I wasn't able to go back and check the paper itself. Maybe that was a consequence of the paper you guys were studying. But overall, I was very happy with all the assignments. I thought you guys did a really good job of understanding each section of the paper. In fact, a lot of the times when I do this class, what kids would often do is send me summaries of like articles that they read from Scientific America, or like a newspaper or something like that. And it was difficult for me to even get them to go through an official paper, kind of from a journal. So the fact that all you guys took the time and the effort to go through what must have been a pretty complicated scientific paper, it speaks a lot to already your scientific literacy, because that can't have been easy. So again, thank you for the effort, and I'll be getting back to each of you as to specific comments I have about it. And so yeah, so we're going to be doing that. So again, today we're going to be doing the art of the literature review. So I wanted to focus on this particular genre of scientific paper first, because I believe that this is something that you can do right now. I'm not sure exactly what grade you all are in. I think you all range, I believe Sean told me that the youngest of you is in 10th grade or 11th standard. So even at that point, even with the resources at hand, everybody here can do a literature review, which I think is one of the most powerful things about this genre of paper, that it doesn't require a lot of resources. Because, as the name says, all you're doing is you're reviewing previous literature. So this is a form of secondary research. Primary research is when you're going out of the world and getting something new. You're doing it, and an experiment that's getting data that's new. Maybe you're doing a survey. Maybe you're doing, maybe you're pouring chemicals into each other in different beakers, but you're doing something that requires going out of the world and getting primary data. But what the literature review focuses on is kind of a version of what you guys were doing in your assignment. You're going out and you're finding a paper, and you're oftentimes you're finding many dozens of papers, and you're using secondary data, i.e. the data of other people's work, of other people's primary work, and you're using that to answer a question. So the initial steps are the same. You're coming up with a question. You're coming up with even a hypothesis. You're coming up with some sort of guess. But the methodology is, instead of directly going out in the world and kind of trying to find that form of data, you are instead, the methodology is going out and finding papers and finding secondary data. So we're going to be going through, in this series of slides, we're going to be going through how to formulate the best kind of question for this genre of paper specifically, how to formulate a hypothesis, and how to do the search itself, how to make it systematic, how to make it scientific. So let's get started. And we're also going to be working through an example of mine that I did when I was in first year of university. So when I was 18, and I wanted to use this example, even though looking at it now, I'm pretty embarrassed at the quality of work that I was doing. But I wanted to do it because, when I was 18, I didn't have any resources. All I had was the internet. So I just wanted to use that example to show you guys, okay, you can do it right now and have a paper that you can present at conferences and really contribute something valuable, even though you might not have a lot of grant money or funds right now. So let's get started. So some more things to talk about in terms of reviewing the homework assignment. I made these slides before when, as I said, some of my students had trouble differentiating between the science articles in a newspaper or a magazine and the research articles in a journal. But it is good to remind you guys, if you're not familiar, I'm sure many of you are, but kind of what are the best academic journals in your subject of interest. I have a link here to a great Wikipedia page, which is just listing excellent academic journals by subject. So if you guys are not already familiar with the most relevant journals of your topic, please go through it and get an idea of, where are people in your field publishing the best data. In addition to that, I would also try and suggest that you just generally keep up to date on developments in your subject of interest. Even if you don't totally understand what people are talking about, I find it really helpful to just start immersing yourself in the world of your field. It's almost analogous to learning a new language. What is the best way to learn a new language? It's not to just, go through a textbook and just start learning. Of course, you have to do that too. It's important to learn the grammar and the rules and to go step by step by step. But another amazing way to learn a language is to just go to a new country that speaks it and just immerse yourself in that world, right? Even if you don't understand what's going on, just centering yourself in that world and forcing yourself to interact, that makes the language acquisition process a lot faster. And I find that it's a similar analogy in terms of scientific literacy and language. If you just immerse yourself in the world of the subject area that you're fascinated by, even if you don't understand every particular, detail of what you're reading or watching, just that immersion process will really, really help. This is something that I did a lot when I was in both in high school and in university, where I was fascinated by neuroscience and psychology and the way the mind worked. And I would read so many things that I didn't understand at all, but I was just interested. And eventually, slowly, things started to click, and I got the definitions of some words that I didn't understand, or I got some more details in my classes. And that immersion really helped me learn faster, I think. So I would recommend you guys do that as well. Okay, so let's talk about exactly what is the purpose and significance of the literature review, um, especially compared to kind of a primary research paper. The point of the review is to synthesize the existing body of work. And this is a very valuable thing, right? I think a lot of students that I talk to, they sometimes feel like they're doing some lesser kind of science when they're doing a review. And I can tell you that in my field, literature reviews are very well respected, and they're very important to the work that we do. Because when you're working for example, when I'm doing my thesis, I'm so focused in on one particular aspect of one particular disease, and it's sometimes really easy to miss the forest for the trees, or to miss the trees for the forest. I always get that saying wrong. But so what a review does is it's placing all these very specific narrow works in a larger context, and it's helping humanity and people and scientists understand, okay, what are the connections between all these all these different works that are in a similar topic. Are there any connections? Are there interesting relationships that can be teased out? And also, the most important thing that I find that a review does, it's pointing the way to what's the next question that should be asked. What's the next form of primary research that people should do? Because it's pointing to gaps. Say you have a question that you want to answer, and you do a review of the current papers that are addressing your question, and you find nothing, right? You find that nobody's addressing the particular question that you want to ask. Then that's amazing. That means, and if you publish that paper, basically you're pointing a beacon at your question, and you're saying, no one has addressed this in this particular way. People should do it, right? So I find a review is an excellent way of pointing out a gap, of kind of highlighting a missing gap in our current in our current form of research and science. And oftentimes it's kind of the first thing that you do when you're in the research field. So, you're not going to be getting a grant just immediately out of nothing to answer a question that you have. Oftentimes you have to prove that the question is worth answering. And one of the best ways to prove it is to say that nobody has addressed a question before, which is where the review comes in to prove that. Okay, so let's talk about exactly what the topic entails. So you want to be defining a topic or a question, often both. You want to be establishing a collecting methodology, and we'll talk about that, what that means. You want to search for materials and collect relevant research. You want to evaluate and analyze the work collected, and you want to present the conclusions. So this might seem, and it is very similar to the structure of the paper that we talked about last week. I think the main difference that a lot of my students had trouble with in the past is the collecting methodology. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit more attention than usual to that particular section. But yeah, so these are basically the most relevant points of any research paper. It's just that the particularities of each are going to be different for a review, but we're going to talk about that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about what are the questions that you should be asking when you're doing a review. Because the questions are a little bit different, right, than when you're doing a primary research. Because a lot of the questions that you're going to be asking are going to be kind of meta questions. And by that, I mean they're issues of theory, of methodology, of policy. You're kind of addressing the questions of your field. And I think that's important to realize when you're thinking of a topic, that that sometimes the best topic for a review is kind of a question about the field itself. And we'll go through some examples of that in the next slide. But other questions that you should be thinking about when you're kind of thinking about your topic is, are you going to be analyzing quantitative research or qualitative research? Depending on your field of choice, it's going to be much easier to do one or the other. But usually people do both, do a combination of both. I know that in my field, there's a lot of quantitative stuff and there's a lot of qualitative stuff. And just to make sure that all of us are on the same page, quantitative just means that there's some amount of statistical information going on. There's some amount of there's some numbers you're crunching. There's some data in terms of numerical data, and qualitative means that it's more like a survey or just general information from a person's interview or something like that. So not statistical analysis. Other things to think about when you're thinking about a topic is, what is the scope, right? What kinds of publications are you using? What's the discipline that you're working in? All of this is going to be important in terms of narrowing down the review and narrowing down what kind of papers that you're going to be looking for. So I find that these questions are really, really excellent for whenever you're starting off a review. When you're struggling to think of a topic, when you're struggling to think of a question that you're interested in your field, I would encourage you to run through all these questions and kind of think about what the answers are for your field. So for example, if you're interested in mathematics, I would, and you're struggling to think, okay, what's something that I can do a review on? And an amazing way to come up with an answer is, what's the hottest debate in math right now? What's the thing that everybody's talking about? What's the thing that everybody's arguing about right now? Or just listing, what are the key concepts that are the most relevant right now? Are there any questions? Are there any problems with the way that things have been addressed? What are the origins of a topic? What are some key sources that people have addressed in the last few years? so I'm not sure if everybody's aware of what epistemology means, but epistemology is basically just a fancy word for the way we know what we know. Um, so kind of what are the knowledge foundations of your discipline? So these are all kind of questions that you should be thinking about when you're coming up with a topic for your review. Yeah, so as Rupsa Sen said, but these topics are too hard to understand, especially the modern topics. That's a great point. And it comes back to a lot of what I said about immersion, right? I would rather you guys do something relevant right now at 60% of comprehension than do something that nobody has any interest in at 100% of comprehension. I totally understand that a lot of the very modern topics are very, very hard to understand, especially in a field like math, which is what I believe you, Sen, is more interested in. I totally get it. So perhaps I can talk to you in particular about if you're going to be doing a review in a very theoretical field like that. Yeah, so perhaps we can talk in private about ideas on how to move forward with that. But I would say in general, even if you're not 100% sure on exactly what the topic is talking about, a lot of what I'm trying to give you guys here is not to allow you guys to write the best paper in the world. Of course, I would love you guys to write an excellent paper and that gets published and all that. That would be amazing. But my goal here is to get you guys to understand your field in a much deeper way and understand research in a much deeper way. And so even if your comprehension of the topic specifically is a little bit lacking, I still think that's an excellent way of learning about your field and learning about research in general and about the methodology of it. So yeah, so I wouldn't worry too much about understanding every detail of a very complicated topic, but yeah. But moving forward, we can definitely talk more specifically about more difficult fields like that. Okay, so let's talk about the validity of the sources. Of course, it's important when you're doing primary research as well. You're going to be going through other people's sources to cite important information, but it's even more crucial in a literature review because your sources is everything. That's the foundation of your paper. So making sure that your sources are good, in fact, is kind of the entire difficulty of doing a review in the first place. And also, so just to, as I was thinking about the question that you asked, Sen, thinking about it also, I think what a review, kind of another purpose of a review is to help a layman better understand a complicated topic. Oftentimes there'll be, in the medical world, there'll be a review that's collecting a lot of information for patients. They'll try and explain what the best drug is for a certain disease or something like that, and they'll try and explain it in a very basic, way for people who aren't perhaps up to date on a lot of the medical information. So I think a review is the best place to start to learn a very complicated topic. But, okay, so some questions to think about when you're thinking about your sources. What sources are you skipping and what sources are you not? That's a key question here when you're thinking about a collecting methodology. You want to make very clear why you're skipping certain ones and why you're accepting others. So So did you not accept them because of sample size, because of the type of research that they were doing, whether it was qualitative or quantitative? Did you only want very long-term studies and therefore you discounted any that were short-term? Did you only want certain kinds of, double-blind studies or placebo-controlled ones? And in a more theoretical world, you might be asking, what particular instruments were they using? What particular forms of analyses were they using? Were they using different, particular forms of analyses in terms of math or physics? So think about what the filter is, and kind of, I use the word criterion, but a criterion is essentially a filter. And that'll also really help focus your collection of primary data. And here's 4 kind of main points to think about when you're going through the sources themselves. What's the credibility? How objective is it? How persuasive is it? And what's the ultimate value? In terms of credibility, for every source you have, you should have an idea of the author's past work. In terms of objectivity, you should have an idea of was there any bias that you can find in the author? Who are they funded by? Is there any, is there ultimately any kind of financial bias, et cetera, et cetera? And I think persuasiveness and ultimate value are also fairly self-explaining. But these are kind of the points that you're going to be talking about when you're talking about certain sources that you found lacking, or certain sources that you found amazing. So for talking about the analysis itself, what you're doing is, so say you come up with 6 papers, right? And 3 of them are supporting your hypothesis and 3 of them are against your hypothesis. A lot of your analysis would be comparing and contrasting what each of these works say and what each of these works have to contribute for or against the hypothesis. And this is just one way of demarcating the papers. But in some way, you have to structure and divide the works into rational categories. It could be just by topic. It could be, in the example I gave, it's for or against one particular formulation of an answer to a question. But whatever it is, you are grouping the works that you collected into different categories, and then you're comparing and contrasting these categories. And that comparing and contrasting is the essential part of your analysis. So we're going to be talking about each of these points in more terms. Another important thing that I want to make clear is in the introduction, as always, right? Like we talked about last week, the intro is about clearly stating an objective, clearly summarizing the issue or subject at hand. But it's particularly important for review to define all the terms. Oftentimes, a review, you're going to be addressing it to a layman audience. So defining every term in question is going to be highly important. When I was first doing these kind of papers, I found this flowchart to really help me think about what the next step was. So let's break it down step by step. Okay, so I'm sure you guys are confused about a lot of what I'm saying, perhaps. So if I were to tell you right now to find a review or to make a review, okay, what would the first step be? Okay, the first step would be to come up with a question, to come up with an objective or a question. And out of that question comes keywords, right? So say your question is something like, what is the effect of X drug on X disease? And in fact, this was what I was studying at first when I did my first review. And this is a very simple question, but the keywords are very easy to find, right? What X drug and X disease. And so the first step always is to kind of find essential keywords. And then you use those keywords to start searching for papers. And then you start to filter the papers, right? You start to come up with an idea of, okay, why do I want certain papers and why do I not find other ones attractive? Let's say that I want the cutoff to be, I want a sample size of only, there have to be at least 15 patients in the study. So any article that I find that has less than 15, I'm going to ignore those. So you start to come up with a filter. So after you find, say, a set of papers, you start to read and you make notes through these papers. And then, so we're going to be talking about exactly what a synthesis matrix is. But essentially, it's just a way of comparing and contrasting the papers and talking about an analysis. And then you use that analysis to write the review itself. So again, you're finding keywords, you're searching for the papers, you're coming up with what you're filtering the papers through. Then you read through the papers and you compare and contrast them, and you come up with analysis, and then you write the review itself and put it all together. So a meta-analysis is one particular form of literature review that is super focusing on statistical data. I believe that a lot of students here are less interested in highly statistical fields like neuroscience or medicine or stuff like that. So I'm going to skip over this essentially, but if anybody is more interested in this, please let me know and I can go through it in more detail. So essentially, it's the same as any other form of review, except you're really focusing in on the statistical methods used in each of the papers, and you're using that to kind of push together a lot of separate forms of data and combine them to come up with a paper that essentially has kind of an inflated sample size. But we can go through that another time, perhaps. I want to talk about a synthesis matrix. Okay, so I guess I didn't put it in this particular of the paper, but basically what a synthesis matrix looks like is you would have, let's see, yeah, so I can analyze it here. So you would have, say, kind of, you'd have columns and you would have rows, right? And let's say, for example, that in each of these rows, you have the paper that you're studying. And by you have the paper, I mean you're essentially writing down the name of it. And in the columns, you have a topic that you're interested in terms of you want to find what each of the papers had to say about each of these particular topics. So, for example, if you're studying the effects of a drug, maybe you have 3 different effects that you want to study. And so maybe you want to find a drug's effect on pain, on depression, and on anxiety. So you have three different topics that you want to, they're kind of subtopics within the larger question that you have about the topic. And then in each of the rows, you have your first paper that you found. Then you have the second paper, and so on and so forth. And then in each of these boxes, you kind of have what did the first paper say about X topic? And then what did the first paper say about the second topic? And so on, right? The point of this is that with this kind of formulation, it becomes very easy to later write an analysis, because essentially your entire analysis is in this table itself. It's just that you have to kind of make it into sentences and make it into words and phrase it in a different way. But the entirety of what you're doing is comparing and contrasting your subtopics with each of these papers. And you're highlighting where the papers differentiate, you're highlighting where they're similar. So I would definitely use this kind of methodology in terms of coming up with when you're thinking about, okay, how do I actually even discuss very different papers? I find this to be the best way of coming up with a way. Okay. Let's see. Clear. Okay, so let's talk about the paper that I did. So the question that I had, and when I say I have, I mean that what my professor asked me to do is, what is the efficacy of opiate antagonists on pruritus? So if you guys have a question like this, I think the three words or four words, I suppose, that I think most people would have trouble understanding is, what does efficacy mean? What are opiate antagonists? And what is pruritus? So efficacy is just another word for effectiveness. Opiate antagonists are a genre or a category of drugs that particularly affect the opiate receptor, and pruritus is just a fancy word for itching. But of course, that's not important. The point is that the first thing that I try to do is use my question to come up with keywords. And then I define the keywords, and using that, I set up the parameters for the validation. I found that the most difficult part of this entire process was this one. So let me go into a little bit more detail about why I set the parameters that I did. It's a very, I think I talked about this 2 weeks ago and in my first topic as a whole. You have to be creative, and sometimes there's no right answer or wrong answer. A lot of what a review comes down to is how good were your parameters. Did I want a sample size of X? Did I only want case studies and I didn't want another type of paper? And what were my reasons, right? Depending on what the question that you're trying to ask, depending on the field you're studying, depending on so many variables, you're going to have different parameters. And a lot of what is your job, really, is what the hard work here is coming up with the best filter. And I think that's really what's going to differentiate an excellent review from an average one. So I would recommend that you guys have a thought process for exactly why you're selecting different papers and why you're ignoring other ones. And it's difficult for me to kind of generalize some general principles on what the parameters should be, just because questions are so different, fields are so different. But again, feel free to email me about any specific topic that you're kind of confused about or that you want help, coming up with a general principle for in terms of your specific field of interest. But yeah, I would definitely recommend that you guys have a very clear idea of why you're setting the parameters that they are. Okay, and of course, then I collected the papers that fit the parameters that I had. Then I synthesized the data, and I used the kind of matrix that we talked about before, and then I concluded on the answer. So this is actually clips from the paper that I wrote. So the first thing, this is from the introduction. Basically, all I did here was define my terms, right? What is pruritus? What is the disease that I was studying? Why did I choose this particular form of drug? Why is my paper even important? Of course, as I said, this is always something that you want to say again and again, that there is a reason that people should read my paper. And what is the objective of it as a whole? And here is my search terms. I found that the best way to just talk about it is here, because as people get confused when you go into general topics. But if you're, whatever search engine that you're using, you should have a similar search term history like this. Even if you're just using Google, you should have a list of exactly what keywords you were searching. You should have a list of when you were searching it. You should have a list of, like, did you specify that you wanted titles? Did you specify that you wanted a particular form of paper, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of what makes this review systematic and scientific and not just very general, I just searched for things and found them and talked about them, is that you're making clear where you searched and what you searched, and that if people went through the exact same process, they would find the exact same papers. So it's very important for you guys to, in your methods section, to say, okay, I used these search engines, I typed in these words, and that's how I found these papers. Every review should also have an explanation of the filters. I call this a coding manual. You can call this a criterion, like we talked about before. You can call it a filter, but whatever you call it, it's the same. Why did, of all the papers that you got hit with when you searched, because even when I searched these terms, right, I probably got hundreds and hundreds of papers. So how did I get from hundreds and hundreds of papers to a dozen? I ran all of them through these filters, right? So I didn't want any papers that didn't have any original data. I didn't want any that didn't talk about itching from a medical condition specifically. I didn't want any that didn't talk about the particular kind of drug that I was interested in. And I didn't want any that wasn't of this particular kind of study. So if you're doing a less biological or less medical-based field, you're going to be having very different filters. But the idea is the same, right? You want to make clear why you chose I'm sure that whatever you guys are going to search, just because of the vast amount of information that's out there, there's going to be a lot of papers for whatever field that you're in. So how did you go from having 100 papers after searching the key terms to selecting the 5 or 6 that you're really interested in? So making that clear is very important. Yes, and I would just use this exact same format. I think this is an excellent one. And if you guys are confused about in the methods about what to do, I would use literally exactly what I did here. Of course, writing your own filters and search terms, and so after I searched these terms on these search engines, and then I ran all the papers through these filters, I came up with these set of papers. So I must have had like a total of 300 papers initially, and then after I ran them all through the filter that I guided you guys through, I came up with only 5 remaining papers that had exactly the conditions that I wanted. And so this is essentially my entire results page. The results section for a literature review is often just highlighting the exact papers that you found and talking perhaps a little bit more about the validity of each of them. So here I talk about perhaps you guys can see, like I talk about what's the source of the study funding, did the authors disclose conflicts of interest. I also talk about general statistical information that's common to each of the papers. So yeah, so I hope that a lot of this comes through with what I'm saying. I know that I picked a very kind of specific topic to go through the review on, but I think it really helps to get a firsthand experience of how someone went through a review. You can also see that essentially this is kind of a kind of the matrix that we talked about before as well, right? I was interested in primarily in the primary outcome and the primary effect size. That was 2 variables that I was very, very interested in. And then I went through each of the papers and said, okay, what did they say about the primary outcome? What did they say about the primary effect size? And you don't even have to care about what primary outcome means or primary effect size means, but the format should be similar for all your guys' reviews. You should be thinking about what each of the papers have to say about certain subtopics. And I would also go through these sources. If you just search them online, they're very easily accessible, and they form a lot more information about a lot of the stuff that I was talking about. Okay. Please, are there any questions that you guys have about any of the stuff that I talked about? Yeah, so a couple more details that I want to touch on. Again, I think the toughest thing here is going to be the filters. And really coming up with a good explanation about why you selected certain papers and why you skipped others. That's going to be kind of the hardest job that you have. So what I want your guys' assignment to be is to go through this. Um, so basically what I want you guys to do is come up with a question that you're interested in studying in your field, and then coming up with a list of keywords, um, and then coming up with a set of filters. So let me type that in chat. So first, define a topic or question in your field of interest. Define a set of keywords to search various engines, and list your filters / criteria. So at this point, you guys don't even have to find the papers of themselves. All I want you to do is think about a question that you're interested in using some of the samples that I talked about before. I want you guys to come up with, like, imagine that you're explaining it to someone who has no idea about the field that you're interested in. So, which is probably true in my case. If you're interested in math, for example, what will be the keywords that that I wouldn't understand, right? And those are probably the set of keywords that you should be searching in particular. And then think about what are the filters that you would use to kind of really narrow in on answering your question in particular. So I think this should be a very easy assignment this week. And if you guys have any questions about it or have run into any trouble with it, please let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, thank you guys for another class. And yeah, it's been a pleasure, and I'll talk to you guys next week. Thank you, everybody.